is Alexa with the Clinician's Atelier and founder of Care Identity. And I'm super excited to have Dr. Kainkaryam today with us. And I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Alexa. Vasanth Kainkaryam here. I am a triple board certified direct primary care doc, also board certified in internal medicine, pediatrics, and obesity medicine. And I own a direct primary care practice in Central Connecticut. And I'm a huge fan of everything and anything about DPCs. So I'm super glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. I do want to ask you, when did you start your DPC?
So I started my DPC in 2019.
That's really interesting because I'm pretty sure it was even harder to market during the pandemic. Tell me a little bit when you decided to start your DPC, what was kind of your approach?
So I think what was different for me is that about 10 years ago with a startup company, I had the opportunity to launch a employer-sponsored DPC practice. It wasn't my first go-around and build practice, right? That I think for me was very different. I knew what the model was about. I knew how it worked. I was comfortable going to employer fairs and tabling and recruiting, and because we had to build our practice from scratch 10 years ago. So none of that stuff was new. What was new for me was now that my own finances are at stake here, I have to make it succeed because I'm taking a big risk. And so what was new is, how am I going to do this with my own budget that didn't have a venture VC-backed funding? It didn't have an initial large upfront investment, and I had to really do it very lean. That probably was the biggest challenge.
When you started, what would you say was one of the first things that you did to begin to market your practice in the very beginning?
One of the first things was start putting stuff out there on social media, right? So I meet people who knew me. I had actually former patients who had been asking me for years, hey, doc, when are you going to start your practice? And so part of it was there were already people who had been asking me for a while. And so I started with them. You always remember your patient number one, right? So my patient number one had been asking me for years, right? They had followed me through, multiple different ventures, including the startup that I had mentioned, because that person at that point was an employee of the organization that was sponsoring the startup. So they got to experience the DPC model. And so, you always start out with, who are the people who know me, who trust me already, and let me just begin to spread the word out, right? And so that's kind of how it began. There's a lot of challenges in terms of how much can you actually market while you're working for someplace else because of non-competes and what could be perceived as, taking patients away. So it can be quite challenging. So you have to kind of be creative with it, but also just more informative, but not true marketing until you're ready to actually start your practice.
So you started with your social media, and then your patients began to find you, follow you. Was that kind of like a nurturing tool for you? And did they eventually convert, since you said that was one of your first strategies?
Yeah, the day after I left my job at that time, I started the practice, right? So it was literally the next day. And it was just sort of full blown, start sharing, telling people, figuring out where I could attend, which meetings I can be a part of. So there really wasn't any downtime, right? I didn't have an opportunity to say, let me take these 2 weeks to figure out how I'm going to do this. It was literally all right, this ended, this began, and now I have no income, so I have to do something. I think it depends on how much time you have, right? So when you don't have time, you sort of build you build the plane while you fly it. So that's kind of how initially I'd done it. The networking opportunities, I think, were very key for me. It was sort of, talking to other business owners, attending chamber meetings, and just sort of figuring out, well, who's in a similar boat. Right around the time that I started, there were actually a bunch of other small businesses that I knew that kind of started too. So then we had this whole, wow, we're doing this together. And, you find people who are on your journey. They might be in different industries. And then you begin to network, and then you begin to share. But what's been interesting is that, when patients really like a doctor, they kind of keep tabs on them. And then I happen to find now, even this weekend, a patient emailed me who I had taken care of back in 2014 to 2016 and was like, all right, we're ready to join your practice, right? So they still trickle in, right? People who you've taken care of at some point. If they really connect with you, they're going to follow you eventually. And so I think that's kind of the interesting piece. Unlike some other doctors who may have had an established practice or panel, in my last job, I didn't keep a panel, right? So I had lost a lot of people by then. And so I was re-engaging with people from scratch, as opposed to, say, a doctor who has an established panel is converting to DPC. I think their marketing strategies are going to be very different than doctors who either didn't have a panel or who are just starting completely from scratch.
Yeah, I like that you said that. And that's kind of something we've kind of the theme throughout amongst others is everyone's strategy is going to look a little bit different. And what may work for one person may not be the strategy for them. And so I kind of like hearing the different stories. I want to touch a little further on social media because I know you make a lot of videos and I know you and I connected a couple years ago. And I kind of want to talk about you growing your online presence, especially through social media, because I see your videos myself, and I've also seen your following has grown a lot over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm envious of people who do social media very well, right? And when every so often when people compliment me, I'm like, really? Like, and so I think so much of this is learning from people who do it well, right? And like yourself and other physicians, you begin to say, what are they doing? How are they doing it well? How can I learn from it? Let me experiment, right? And so much of this is trying different things. So for a while, I would try the videos that were just all audio, and then you're like, hey, click here, and then you have, you're let me point my finger in the air and have something pop up, and then so I think so much of this is experimenting with what you're comfortable in, right? And our current experimentation is using accents, right? Like I speak a bunch of different languages. So now like I get to be the patient who my persona is a recent immigrant, and all of a sudden I would be talking like this. And then, let me pretend to be the doctor. And then all of a sudden I'll talk like this. And so it's finding things that I think that make you feel authentic. And that's hard to do because for a while you're just looking at the people who are doing well and you're like, oh, they got 7,000 views. Let me try to do what they do. But if you're not like the inherent TikTok dancer, like it's just not going to work. So I think part of the journey for me has been, how do I learn from people? How do I get ideas like for people like yourselves who are like, think of formatting your page this way or that way. And in certain things, you're like, this is just too stressful for me. Like as much as I love the color coordination, it was coming in my way of actually posting content. So I let go of that and I came up with another idea. So there's you have to like marketing. And I think for me, inherently, I enjoy marketing, right? I enjoy figuring out how do I design this and how do I design that. But that's just not every doctor, right? And so much of this is what are your strengths? What are you good at? What do you have time for? And at some point you have to let go of stuff. So right now I actually have someone who's helping me create some of the content, but part of it's training her in terms of like, here's my vision. How can we help create it? But then also, what's your vision and what have I not thought about? So it's a journey. It's not for every doctor. Some have to be coached, but I think that if you have to find what is authentic in yourself and see how to project it.
Yeah, I really love that. I absolutely do. So, me personally, when I saw the trending top TikToks or the trending videos, that's just not me. Like, I'm very much an educator and I just really like giving value and like helping people, giving, tips and ideas. And so, you will never find me dancing because I am so not like, it's weird because I think I'm like I'm I'm like I'm funny. I don't know if I'm funny, but like I think I'm funny in my own way, and my family knows that, and people close to me know that. But I also I'm just not the kind of person just get out there to like go and do the trendy stuff. So I do think I agree with you when you say trying to copy what someone else is doing and it's not authentic to you. Sometimes I think when you're authentic, it gives them a better idea of who you are. And when they have a better idea of who you are, and they get a feel for your personality, they're more likely to want to engage with you because, like, oh, I like him. Like, I like your more recent videos where you did do the immigrant accent, and you're just like sitting as if you're on the patient table, and then you're the doctor as well. And I'm like, I like that because there's kind of like this comedic aspect to it. It shows that you're kind of fun and nice. And like, I'd want a doctor like that. I mean, if I saw you and I didn't know you and I was in your area, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I like him. And so people sometimes don't understand, like, people do business with other people. and they're not really necessarily hiring the brand name. Yes, it's nice to have the aesthetics and have a very clean brand, but at the end of the day, like you said, you love marketing, you love kind of doing the design and being creative. And I think that is one thing is like many times people don't want to market themselves, or they don't feel comfortable, or they don't know how to do it. And so kind of stepping outside of that comfort zone is something that I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, is you had to get comfortable being uncomfortable essentially and putting the videos out there. I wanted to ask you, you said something that really sparked my interest. You said that when you went to events and networking events, they were very strategic. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So, I think part of it is, for example, like, what do I want my market geography to be? And how do I make sure I'm physically present in those geographies, right? So, for example, like when I first started, I live in South Windsor. I intentionally chose a BNI chapter that was on the other side of the river, right? Because in Connecticut, people just don't cross the river. But for me to grow a market share, I intentionally chose something that was very different. The easiest thing would have been for me to grow in my local geography, right? But that would limit me for a variety of reasons. So I intentionally chose geography that was contradictory to what I already had available. So part of that was it was intentional, right? And so that led to now my patients coming from an hour and a half away at times to our practice, right? And so geography became less and less a barrier. So, but that was an intentional choice. So it was kind of, as you begin to say, well, where do I want to be? You know, do I want to do I want to be all Connecticut? Do I want to be small town? Like, am I looking to create multiple sites in the future that in order to do that, I need to have to be a known entity in different areas? So those are all kinds of the things to think about. I think it's different when you have a market such as Boston or the Carolinas or Texas, where DPC is a very known entity, then you don't have to spread yourself so much. But I think in a case where ours DPC is still really, really hard in Connecticut, right? Many DPCs have failed. They've converted back to insurance-based practices. There are some DPC docs who've said, you know what, I just can't market, so I'm going to close my practice. So it's not uncommon in Connecticut to have a struggling DPC practice. And so for me, I had to do, what do I need to do to be the most successful? And how do I spread myself out a little bit more? So that is an example of being very strategic.
So that was kind of your tactic, was like, in order to be able to thrive, I'm going to have to kind of step outside just my space or just my area. That's actually a really good point, because, Houston's ginormous, and they always joke and say Houston's an hour away from Houston. And I did have a DPC doctor once who was like 45 minutes, an hour away from me. And I chose to go to her, not only because she was a past client, but also because I really liked her offerings. And so I think, especially when you begin to educate your community well, which is what it seems you have done, uh, being able to get people to come in and want to be part of your practice obviously means you've done a good job educating them. And also, like you said, stepping outside and going further and being strategic. So I definitely do like that. Um, how have you, besides being strategic, but like, how have you been able to stay strong? Because you went through the pandemic. That must have not been easy. You said you started in 2019. How have you, over the last 4 or 5 years, or about 5 years now, been able to just continue growing and maintaining your practice's success?
So the pandemic was interesting because on one hand, it shattered a lot of businesses. On the other hand, it highlighted the value of DPC, right? So during the pandemic, once again, right, this model of care for me was not new. I had done it before, so I knew what to highlight. So in the pandemic, I would emphasize the fact that we're a low volume practice. Would you rather go sit in a waiting room and potentially risk getting infected because there's 30 other people there? Or would you rather go to a place where there is no waiting room and there's just one patient at a time? So you begin to highlight that piece. Would you rather go to a place where your doctor you could just text, or would you rather go to a place where you have to show up in person? the world began to catch up to technology that DPC was already doing. I was texting my patients 10 years ago, in the startup world because it was a smart thing to do. Why would you need to come in for a rash? Send me a text message first. So I think that what the pandemic really did was highlight the value, and it helped me shape what do I want to emphasize, because all of a sudden I'm like, let's talk about common sense, right? Let's talk about the medical infrastructure that is built in a certain way. And now the pandemic is still forcing you, at least for a while, to work in that world that now increased your risk of problems. And now all of a sudden, here's this alternative world where you don't have to be afraid. Your doctor's still available. You can still get the stuff that you need. And it just kind of made more sense. So the pandemic was interesting because I think for a lot of us, yeah, it may have stunted our growth a little bit because we couldn't do as much as we did. But I think for the patients who experienced it, they were like, this makes sense. Um, and then afterwards, like the first 2 years, I didn't really have it, it was just me. I didn't have any team members, right? You're sort of doing the one person show and trying to like build around. And then, I think a lot of it with our practice, things just kind of happened by accident, right? So people wanted to start shadowing us because we, were one of the few places that would accept, people who are applying to medical school and residency to do shadowing. And then some of those folks turned into future team members who were, on salary. Some of those folks continued on in other roles, right? But then we became this nurturing ground for future doctors. And now they're going on to residency and want to do DPC. And so it just kind of, a lot of it organically evolved with people who are looking for something more. So there's very few people, if anyone at all, in our team that was an intentional hire. Most people, if not everyone, I'd say was just put it out there and the universe somehow made the right person appear. So that I'm very, very grateful for.
Awesome. I have a couple of questions here, so I'm going to kind of throw them at you. One is mainly setting kind of expectations. I want to kind of focus on the new person maybe just starting, right? What was your patient panel, would you say, right in 2019, right before the pandemic got really crazy and early, like in March of 2020, kind of in that starting phase of 19? I know you already came with a background, but talking about you specifically, what did that look like for you in the beginning?
I had a lot of free time. I probably saw a patient a day, maybe two. You're right. And I think, and part of the rules that I was set by the boss at home was I can't take any loans. I have to moonlight or work additional jobs to fund my practice, and I couldn't take money from the household in exchange for her holding the fort at home with our young kids, right? That meant that, all right, so how do I design my schedule where I'm available enough, but then I need to still moonlight, I need to still make money, and even if I didn't contribute to the household, I could keep the practice afloat as we were growing. And so it was pretty hard, right? Because at one point you see these stories in particular areas where DPCs know, and they're like, yes, within 6 months, I'm at 100 patients and 200, 300. And you're like, wow, woe is me. I have like 15. And so then part of it's like you begin to put your business hat on and you begin to say, okay, how else, what other income streams can I think of? What else can I do? Where else can I moonlight? And so at the end of the day, your goal is I need to build my practice, but I need to maintain a certain level of income to help my household. And how do I do that? And where else can I look for additional part-time jobs? And so I did a bunch of part-time jobs. And I think those were very key in me being able to stay through it. I think if someone's going into this saying, I'm only going to do DPC, well, it's going to be tough, right? Unless you're in a market where like you're going to pop up very quickly and you're going to fill, if you're sort of trailblazing a market, it's going to be really hard.
How long would you say it took you to kind of meet your patient panel? Do you still do any moonlighting or anything extra? Or are you full time in your practice now?
I do, and partially because we're growing the practice, right? And so I need to fund it somehow because now we have, team members and we've got salary and we just are almost at this new $1 million project almost that we're working on. So I think I'm not where I want to be to say I have achieved what I wanted to. So because of that, I still have to invest back into the practice to keep it growing. And so I still have to take home some money. And so if I wanted to today, could I run my entire practice with one team member and do everything myself, cap my panel, and have a very comfortable, profitable living? Absolutely. But I think every doctor has to choose, do they take what they would take home? Do they want to keep investing in rebuilding? Or do they want to say, I don't want to build anymore. I'm going to take that home. And this is the extent of my growth. And that's what each doctor has to figure out how ambitious they're going to be.
I really love that. I like setting real expectations because I think I'm tired of hearing the narrative in business in general, not just private practice, but just in businesses, like where people have gotten, but not how hard it was to get there. Like I'd always laugh when people are like, I wish I had your schedule. I'm like, really? I work like 60, 80 hours a week sometimes. Lately, I don't even sleep because I've been launching my other product and I still have to work client projects. And sometimes I go to bed, I'm not kidding, at 7 in the morning because I'm crazy. But my thing is, there is this level of like, yeah, there may be some people that may cap and they're comfortable with that. And that's okay. That's why you do have to decide what is your level of success and what are you happy with. But at the same time, I think it's good to be realistic. But like, that's not everyone's story. Sometimes you do have to work the full-time job or work another job while you grow your dream in your business. I worked full-time for like 8 years while I grew my design company. That's why I didn't grow very fast, because I also didn't take loans and I also had a fund. So I was self-funded and I was very young when I started my business. So I didn't have money. So I like the fact that you're being transparent and sharing that, because I think I talk to DPC doctors all the time that get very discouraged in the beginning because they don't feel like they're seeing the success stories and they thought they would be at a certain place by now, or they thought they'd have a certain patient panel by now. What I like about what you're sharing is you're also like, I believe in myself and I have this dream and I'm going to keep growing it, and it's growing and it's working, but it's not where I want it yet. And I'm willing to invest further when I need to get where I want to be. And I really like that you shared that.
Thanks. I mean, I think the reality, right? Like, and once again, so like I shared with you, we bought this huge property. There are many, many months where I don't pay myself anything, right? Because on one hand, I'm investing in this property. So as a DPC doctor, you have to begin to think of what is value to you, right? Is value to you taking home a paycheck all the time? Is value to you saying, right now, what I would have taken, I have equity in X, Y, and Z, and if you didn't pay yourself at all for many months, is that a failure? Or is that a choice that you made to say, this is part of building that bigger dream, and now I know I have equity in X, Y, and Z, and that has value, and so that's worth more than me having paid myself. So I think that there's this element of what defines success, right? And I never thought I'd be a commercial property owner. That was like far, far away from what I ever wanted. And I just turned into that. It's a journey, but you need, at least in my case, a spouse who's very supportive of it, right? Because I'm the one who can carry away, and she's the one who's like, whoa, slow down a little bit. I think that's the piece where a lot of us really feel like money is success. Have I met my salary from before? Is my practice more of a nonprofit? Am I actually taking money back? And then you talk to business owners who, like, I was meeting with a friend yesterday who also started her business similarly. And, she was telling me nightmares of her closing when we were doing it. I'm like, oh, thank God, someone else. I just don't think we talk enough about, like you said, the struggles. And once you do, you're like, all right, I'm not alone. I don't have the glitz and the glamour of like the beautiful offices. And, people sometimes they start their practice having bought property. I started renting a small room from a psychic. You really just have to figure out and get comfortable and confident in your definition of success. That is the hardest part because, in our previous worlds, we had certain standards that won't apply anymore.
What advice would you give to the person starting, since we're on this topic? What advice would you give to someone starting to encourage them, or also just to help them on this journey to, whether it is DPC or just private pay in general?
Figure out why you really want to do it. There's plenty of people I talk to who think DPC is this panacea, and I work harder than probably I have ever in any of my other jobs, right? And I think it is not for the faint of heart. We're not trained for business. You're constantly looking at cash flows. You're like, can I afford this month? Can I not afford this month? My dad was a business, so I had understood there's some months where you don't bring in much and other months that you have a surplus. But then if you don't figure out how you're going to spend it wisely, so first you have to figure out, why do you want to do DPC? The second is, do you want to own a DPC or do you want to work in a DPC, right? Not every DPC doctor needs to be a business owner. So maybe you don't want to have the business part of it. You don't want the stress of figuring out the finances and payroll and all that stuff. And maybe you just want to be a part of a DPC practice. So I think that there were these initial trailblazers where everyone felt like they had to start a DPC practice. And now we're in a world where there are plenty of practices to join. If you want to have good clinical work and love what you do, and you're just not a marketer or a business person, then join a practice. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to have your brand. Just find a place that values you for the individual that you are, and you can still express yourself in your clinical practice.
I have one question. I never asked you on this, but I wonder if what you would say. It came to my mind. What do you think? Why do you think people fail in DPC?
This was a topic given by one of the DPC doctors at the AFP conference earlier this year, and it was fascinating, where he actually looked at all the clinical studies and actually has very concrete data points as to why people fail DPC, right? And I think there's a few different things. One of the ones that struck me was that in the data he looked at, the people who had successful DPC practices had a partner. The people who did not have successful DPC practices were on their own. And I cannot tell you how important, for so many reasons, it is. And I was like, wow, that makes so much sense. Because, when I go and I vent to my wife, I'm like, oh my God, or like, all right, here's our personal finances. Like you need that other person who believes in you and who is willing to take that journey with you. So that was one that I never thought about, but statistically, that was a very significant one. Not that someone who is single or without partner can't do it, but I think that, once again, an entrepreneur is very heavy. And there's a lot in medicine. Not only do we carry the emotional burden of our patients, we now carry the emotional burden of being a business owner. And you need someone to be on that journey with you. So I think that was one that was really interesting. I think another one that an agent once told me, it's a personality of the doctor, right? There's an element of being outgoing, whether you are or you're not. You have to at least try to be, to the degree that you're comfortable with, and not being afraid to laugh at yourself and at times humiliate yourself. I do it all the time. And I think that at least shows who you are. We live in a world where it's interesting, right? We look at, and I'm not going to get into politics, but like, what do we want from our leaders or the people we look up to, right? How much do we care what they do professionally? How much do we care about who they are as a person? I think the world now, because there's so much information exchange and stuff, we kind of want to know the personal lives of people. And there's a lot of people who are not comfortable sharing their personal lives, right? How many kids do you have? How old are they? Yada, yada. I found that in DPC, I had to make myself more vulnerable than I had done before, because I needed to show people who I really was. I needed to show them that I'm not one person in front of them, and then behind their back, I'm going to go do a bunch of other stuff. Like, do I love my oatmeal cream pies? Absolutely. Does it mean I should be having them? No, but I'm not going to lie to them and pretend to be this like saintly doctor that like would never have an oatmeal cream pie, right? Like that is, and granted, I haven't in many years, but those are the kinds of things that I think people, they want to know who you really are, because what they're looking for is the connection, right? And so are they coming for you or are they coming for DPC? I don't know. Initially, I think they come for you because you are the practice. At some point, your marketing transitions to, hey, I can't take everybody, so I need to have the practice be the focus and less about me. But when you're starting, it's got to be about you, and you've got to figure out, how much are you willing to make yourself vulnerable? My wife is not. She's very private. And so, and then you always have that discussion of, how much of our life are you making public? How much are you being private? And I've had this discussion with so many of the DPC docs who are brilliant on social media. These are the same conversations.
I have learned in sales, whether I give an analogy or I give a testimony of something that happened that connects with them, it sticks better in that person's mind than if I were just feeding information to them that's never going to click. The stories click, and there's studies that stories click. And it's because your brain, when you can relate to it or it speaks to you, like you said, the connection aspect and the authenticity aspect of you being real, people do come, especially that's something I tell people in this DPC market. I have noticed it is very, very much based on the individual. Like you're building relationships. It's not like corporate America where you're going for a business and there's no real connection and it's just a service, versus DPC is very much built on like care and understanding and one-on-one. And I feel like in a way that's how I am as a designer. Like I really try to understand the person I work with. I try to be one-on-one with them. And so I don't kind of fall into the corporate America, but I am very much the brand, like you said. But I have a team. But again, I'm always the front end helping everyone. And then I have the support behind me. Always been like a very social butterfly from a very young age. I would go talk to like strangers all the time. So much that my dad played a trick on me. And he's like, Alex, go talk to that person over there. I was like, okay. So I walked over there. I was like, I don't know, 8, 6, 7, something like that. It was a mannequin. One of those mannequins that looked very real. And then I realized it wasn't real. But no, I mean, at the end of the day, you do have to kind of put yourself out there. And I think that is kind of hard for people, especially when they don't want to open up and they're a little more reserved. But people do want to get a feel for your personality. And that's okay. Some people might be reserved as well and might be drawn to that kind of physician or clinician. I wanted to ask you one last question. One is, I know you originally did your own brand and website, or did you kind of collaborate with someone? Tell me a little bit about your journey with when you started like your presence.
Initially a lot of it, the logo I had designed, but I had very sort of specific things I was looking for, and I fell in love with the logo. It was so modern and trendy, but like the initial website, my very first one, I designed it myself. Like I like tinkering, and I'm pretty good with technology. And then I had someone design part of it, and then I took it back, and then I had designers design it, and then a coder code it, and then I took it back. And now my latest iteration, I've taken it all back and I'm controlling the whole thing again. I'm very particular about the way I want something to look at in the end, right? I have this vision in my mind and I need someone to replicate that vision. And the joke in the office is like, no matter who arranges something like on our shelves or whatever, like don't even bother too much because he's going to go and like tweak stuff around it anyway. I think from an aesthetic standpoint and from a branding, it's very much I know that the image and what I want. The hard part is figuring out how to get there. And that's when you begin to learn from the people who do it really well. And I think that look at everything as an opportunity to learn. Oh, how did that person have their website? Oh, I like that idea. And you begin to gain inspiration and you ask, right? Like, hey, can you teach me, right? Very few people are going to be like, no, I don't want to teach you. And I think that's really the key is learn from everything around you, right? And even the places you don't agree with, learn from them. How are they marketing something like, for example, large corporate hospitals? Why is it working for them? And how do you now begin to learn from what's working and somehow make it your own? And I don't know if people necessarily look at things all the time with that lens of learning, right? They're either looking at with distaste or animosity or jealousy, as opposed to saying, how can I take this and make it a part of me? And I think that's kind of the piece that I love about marketing is that you can never be good enough because there's always someone, something, doing something that is just one notch above creativity than yours, and you want to try to do it.
I think one thing I picked up is why reinvent the wheel if it's working. Learn and it's so hard in marketing because technology is always changing, and so you have to always evolve and you always have to learn and develop and grow, and that's true with anything. I like that, the lens of learning. I definitely like that. Well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast and your time today and just the value and everything that you shared. I probably could have asked you a lot more questions, but I appreciate everything we did discuss today.
Awesome. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much for joining in today's podcast. And I just want to let you know, if you're not already following us on Instagram, I definitely would go follow the Clinicians Atelier. It's also linked in the bottom of each episode. I am creating a lot more content. I've created 3 different freebies on top of the ebooks that I've mentioned previously. So make sure you go snag those. I'm also doing 1 live coaching call a month on the second Sunday of every month in our free Facebook group. You do need to be in our Facebook group to participate. There's also an open live Q&A after where you can ask your any marketing questions you may have. And I'm also launching the Marketing and Sales Academy, where I'll be uploading the tutorials along with other content throughout this year. So go ahead, if you haven't already, check that out. And thank you so much for listening.